say, who will bring me down to the ground? God says, I will. You may think you're secure, but I'll bring you down from there. And so they really had no reason to boast. They had no reason to be prideful in their circumstances. And yet sometimes we can be guilty of that. Have you ever been in a situation where you heard of the transgression of another, the sin of another, and your prideful response is, well, you'd never catch me doing that. Or even I know better than to do that. Well, let me tell you something. You better be careful. Because if any man thinks he stand, take heed lest he fall. 1 Corinthians 10, verse 12. Pride goes before destruction, and a haughty spirit before fall. Proverbs 16 at verse 18. And so, though the Edomites thought that they were protected from any kind of invasion or protected from any kind of calamity like Judah was facing, they were wrong. God said, I will bring you down to the ground, though you think no one can. They were guilty of being blinded by their own pride. Then, number 4, and finally today, Edom was guilty of taking advantage of the oppressed. They were guilty of taking advantage of the oppressed. Back to the book of Obadiah, look at verses 13 and 14. He says, you should not have entered in the gate of their calamity. You should not have entered the gate of my people in the day of their calamity. Indeed, you should not have gazed on their affliction in the day of their calamity, nor laid hands on their substance in the day of their calamity. You should not have stood at the crossroads to cut off those among them who escaped, nor should you have delivered up those among them who remained in the day of distress. Did you catch what the prophet said the Edomites had been guilty of? They did not create the calamity initially against Judah and Jerusalem. They weren't the ones responsible for the initial invasion by whoever this was that was attacking Jerusalem at the time. But when the adversity came, they jumped on the opportunity to kick Jerusalem and Judah while they were down. They actually looted Jerusalem. Notice what the prophet said, you should not have laid hands on his substance in the day of his calamity. It's as if the Edomites had stood aloof initially, verse 11, and watched as Judah was being attacked and Jerusalem being ransacked by some outside force. And then once the Edomites realized that Judah could not defend itself, they go into Jerusalem and start carrying off the material goods of the people of Judah. What an amazing thing that these people felt justified in doing. It reminds me of the actions of some in the past history of our own country. I think about the L.A. riots back in the early 90s, or in the aftermath of Hurricane Katrina in recent times. How when people saw that there were others in a state in which they could not defend themselves or defend their property, they just go in and start taking stuff. In come the opportunity for people who have no morals to come in and start stealing from people that had no way to defend themselves. You can't get much lower than that. That's what the Edomites had done. And God condemned them for it. But notice also how he speaks of how the Edomites would even capture those of Judah who were trying to escape, and they would turn them over to the enemy. What a terrible, terrible thing. You know what the Edomites essentially did? They're sitting back and they're watching this calamity happen to Jerusalem. And initially, they didn't know how it was going to turn out. They didn't know what was going to happen. Perhaps the people of Judah would be able to defend themselves and repel this insurgents. But they didn't know, so they just sat back. And they waited to see who would get the upper hand. And then they decided, here's where we'll place ourselves. When they saw that Judah was the one being defeated, then they jumped in on the side of these attackers and started working with them. Well, that's unprincipled. Don't be like the Edomites and just put a wet finger in the air to see which direction the spiritual winds are blowing before you decide where it is you're going to take your stand. Because it really doesn't matter what other people think, and it doesn't matter what other people say. What matters is, what has God said? And let's take our stand with Him, regardless of whether everybody else joins with us or nobody joins with us. That's the way we ought to react. But that's not the way Edom did. In 2 Timothy 4, verse 16, Paul said, "At my first defense, no one stood with me. All forsook me." But in the next verse he said, "But the Lord stood with me and strengthened me and delivered me." You know, you may feel like at times that you're standing alone, but in reality you aren't. Because if you're standing for what's right, the Lord will stand with you and will see you through. What a sad conclusion to this matter is found in verse 15 of Obadiah, where he says, "For the day of the Lord upon all the nations is near. As you have done, it shall be done to you." Edom was going to reap what it had sown. And God had told them earlier in verses 5 and 6, if thieves came in among you and stole your substance, they would leave something behind. In other words, they wouldn't take every last thing you had. Thieves would just take what they needed and they'd leave the rest. God says it's not going to be that way when I come through, because you will be utterly destroyed. The sins of Edom are with us today, sadly, so don't be among those that mimic their sins. If you'd like to have a copy of today's lesson, then we want to offer that to you free of charge. If you'll contact us at Post Office Box 865, Hurst, Texas, 76053, or email us at requests@thetruthinlove.com, or go to our website, thetruthinlove.com, and order materials there. Or you can leave a voicemail on our free 800 number, 800-819-2966. Tell us whether you want an audio cassette, audio CD, DVD, or written transcript, and we'll send that back to you free of charge, no cost or obligation. I thank you for watching the program today. Until next time, may God bless.
I am meek and lowly. Come and trust my light. Come, my yoke is easy, and my burden's light. Have you by temptation often conquered men? Has a sense of weakness brought distress within? Christ will sanctify you if you claim His best. In the Holy Spirit He will give you rest.